Hello and welcome back to Zenin Fanfics. Today we're starting part 4 of an exciting new series, What If Villain Deku Became a Teacher at UA? If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe for more content. The story we're featuring is written by Bloomer Bill on fanfiction.net. You can find all the relevant links in the description, so be sure to check out the author's profile and say hello. Now, let's dive into the story. Izuku partially regretted listening to what Yuri-san knew of He Who Takes, or All for One as he was more widely known to the Japanese underground. Then again, he wasn't sure how anyone was supposed to handle learning a literal ancient evil was real. But as he drove home, he couldn't help questioning how All for One had remained so well hidden for so long. Even if he stuck to the shadows like Yuri-san explained, there was no way with a countrywide network as he supposedly has that the government didn't know about him. And if they did, why hasn't anyone blown the whistle on this and have an international warning sent out? Because All for One was clearly a global threat to everyone just from what little Yuri-san knew of him. There would be no way for any one hero to take him down, and All for One would be a threat to everyone, not just the quirkless. Izuku severely doubted that All Might could handle All for One, number one hero or not. Izuku was still troubled by the thought of how easily All for One remained hidden in the open. When he got home, he automatically fell into autopilot and just went through the motions, moving around the kitchen without problems considering how often he had worked with multiple injuries previously. Izuku, Inko called, making him jolt, and he turned from the peppers he was cutting to his mom. Hi mom, did you just get home? He greeted, mentally chastising himself for being so caught up in his thoughts. Izuku, I've been calling you for the last minute, she told him, her concern obvious as she walked over to him. Izuku's eyes fell to the peppers he was cutting as he avoided eye contact. Oh, I'm as sorry mom. He tried to apologize, rubbing the back of his neck only to stop when he felt a hand on his shoulder and turned back to his mom. Izuku, what's wrong? She asked. He immediately pulled away and waved his hands. And nothing is wrong mom. I was just... He responded, panicking slightly. Izuku, Inko interrupted with a knowing tone. You know you can tell me anything, right? She said, and Izuku's shoulders slumped. He turned his body away from his mom. It's really not that big of a deal. I just met at 2 toes in Kumamoto. He explained, choosing to throw the whole He Who Takes All for One problem as far as he could from this conversation. Oh, what were they like? She asked, intrigued herself by the prospect. He was a lot like Emmy actually, Izuku admitted. Osamu-kun just turned 10, and he wants to help people by becoming a doctor. Izuku elaborated, fiddling with the hem of his shirt. It just reminded me of my dream of being a hero. He told her, and Inko responded a soft, I see. He sighed, Mom, I just want to help people. And as seeing so many people living like they do in the districts just hurts. Izuku confessed, feeling tears pricking the corners of his eyes. He hugged himself after unintentionally telling her about his feelings about the other thing on his mind. The way his chest felt painfully tight whenever he thought about the sometimes awful living conditions some of his students lived, and learning that they weren't so uncommon when he visited the other red light districts. It had been temporarily pushed aside from his mind in the wake of the danger from All for One. Izuku flinched when he felt a hand cup his face, but let it turn him back to his mom and saw her sad smile. Oh Izuku, there's nothing wrong with how you're feeling. You've always had a heart that was just a bit too big for your own good. Inko cooed, rubbing her thumb on his cheek. And it's okay to be sad or disappointed about not pursuing your dream, she added, hand moving from his face to his arm. Izuku ducked his head, looking away from her again, as an odd, prickly feeling formed in his chest when she said that. The part of him that wanted to be a hero would probably never fully disappear, but the Southside Inferno had firmly ripped his rose-tinted view of heroics away from him. And while the other 20 red light districts he had been to weren't as bad as the South Side, it hadn't helped his changing opinion on the heroics profession. But Izuku, personally speaking, Ever since January, I think you've become something so much better than a hero." Inko confessed much to Izuku's shock. What? He questioned, utterly gobsmacked. She smiled back at him. "Heroes do a lot for a lot of people. And maybe there are some exceptions, but heroes don't stick around long after their job is done," she told him, struggling to find the words to properly explain. Once the villain I is defeated or the disaster cleaned up, they move on to the next problem, leaving the victims to deal with the aftermath on their own. The most they'll usually do is pay for the damage they see caused or donate money to charities. She elaborated, and Izuku knew she was right about limelight heroes anyway, even if it hurt to admit to that fact to himself. But what you're doing right now, you're doing so much more for them. You're helping them survive day to day and giving them the chance to make their lives better by teaching everything you know. Izuku, why you've done for those people, what you'll continue doing for them, they'll never forget that," she said, not bothering to hide the pride in her voice as she did, making Izuku a bit flustered. "You don't need a plastic card to change someone's life, Izuku. You're already doing that. And even though it means I can't see you as much and I'm utterly terrified that you might get hurt one day, that will never change how proud I am of the man you're becoming," Inko told him with confidence and certainty she rarely possessed. Upon finishing her speech, Izuku felt big fat Midoriya family tears pouring from his eyes, completely overwhelmed by the emotions dredged up from his mother's words. "Mom," he whimpered, wondering for what was probably the 1,000th time what he had done to deserve such a wonderful person for a mother. Inko smiled at him softly and reached for his face with both hands, then brought his forehead to hers, letting him get it all out as he cried, then gave him her work hanky. Izuku was still trying to put himself back together into something resembling a functioning member of society when his mom loudly clapped her hands. "I think it's been too long since we had a pizza night, so we should do that tonight," she declared with a determined look on her face. But I've already started cutting peppers for stir-fry," Izuku pointed out. "We'll just put it on the pizza. I've always wanted to try peppers on pizza," Inko cheerfully responded. "But it's the spicy peppers, and we don't have any dough," Izuku countered. "Then we'll just have to make it from scratch," she replied, unbothered by the fact, and not addressing the peppers. "Mom," Izuku whined in protest, but couldn't stop himself from smiling as she left the kitchen to change out of her scrubs. When Inko returned, the two of them got to work making pizza together, listening to hand-up radio as they did, singing along when a song they liked came on, and Izuku had even been prompted to dance along with her for one. Neither of them were very good at either, but Izuku couldn't deny that it was fun to do after all the stress of the past few days. And as the pizza baked in the oven, Izuku and Inko transformed the living room into a pillow fort again. Later, both Izuku and Inko were wrapped up in blankets watching Batman vs. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, one of Izuku's favorite movies, and eating a slice of pizza. The danger of all for one hadn't left Izuku's mind, but his mom's attempt to cheer him up had certainly helped to melt away the weight on his shoulders. And for the first time since Kumamoto, Izuku felt himself start to actually relax. Izuku sighed, leaning back against the couch, content with good food in his stomach and wrapped up in a fluffy blanket. Turning to his mom, he couldn't help feeling really grateful for everything she had done for him. "Hey Mom," he said, and she turned to him with a soft hum of acknowledgement. "Thank you for everything you've done for me. You're the greatest, Mom," Izuku told her as he snuggled up to her. She chuckled softly and ruffled Izuku's hair. "What are you talking about, Izuku?" Inko asked with a hint of amusement in her tone. "Visiting the other districts reminded me how lucky I am to have someone amazing as you in my life," he answered, moving closer to her, and Inko smiled back. "You're too kind to me, Izuku," she responded by kissing his forehead. "I'm just trying to do what's best for you," she said modestly as she averted her eyes. "And I'm going to tell how incredible you are for that," Izuku replied, hugging her and burying his head in her chest, making Inko laugh. Hugging him back, "Oh Izuku," she exclaimed, making Izuku's heart feel even lighter, even then burst into tears. It was fine, they were happy tears. Tomorrow Izuku would be leaving for Niigata and worry about the ever-looming issue of all for one being real meant for him and his future work in the red light districts. But that would be a problem for future Izuku to deal with. For now, though he was going to enjoy a movie, eat the pizza he made, and relax with his mom in the little bubble of peace, feeling like he was miles away from his troubles as he steadfast ignored the rest of the world. Just for a little while. The next morning was fairly easy on Izuku as he woke up to his mom making breakfast for the two of them, and after eating Izuku shooed his mom off to her job, insisting he could clean everything up on his own. The heartwarming feeling hadn't fully left with his mom, but she had taken a good chunk of it. The apartment just felt emptier without his mom there, so he quickly cleaned up to get straight into his college work before heading off to Niigata. Izuku was excited to return to the south side and already lined up somewhere to stay with one of his students. He was really looking forward to seeing the kids there again and was expecting some kind of warm greeting given his relationship with them. He decided to leave his car at the apartment since he could get around much easier with the public transit system and would be back in Shizuoka in 2 days. He also wouldn't need as much stuff, so taking the car would only be more of a hassle. Izuku rode on the train to the south side, and admittedly the over-looming danger of all for one had returned to the forefront of his mind. He tried to think through a rational plan to do with this knowledge. The first was what he wanted to do with the information. Did he want this terrible person gone? Yes, but Izuku wasn't an idiot who would try to take on the quirk-era Bujiman, so he'd just have to avoid him for now and figure out where he was more actively involved. The more he thought of it, the more it sunk in that there was nothing he could actually do with this information. Even if he didn't say anything about what Yuri-san told him and just what he found independently, he would be laughed out of any police station or hero agency he had the nerve to go to. And regardless of whether or not anyone would take him seriously, Yuri-san warned him that All for One kept his many eyes and ears out for anyone that goes around throwing his name. So considering what Zuki said about quirkless people already disappeared around All for One, Izuku didn't think it would be wise for him to poke the bear. But he also didn't want to just let this go on, even if he couldn't do anything about it right now. Once he had a way to deal with All for One that didn't involve probably never being seen or heard from again, he could address it. Until then, he'd just have to tiptoe around him, no matter how much he didn't like it. All for One aside, Izuku's thoughts trailed off as he got off the train and walked from the station to south side. He was just about to enter the boundaries when he was tackled. He flailed, almost falling over before his body went rigid. Deku-Sensei! Midoriya-chan! 2 squealing cries came from his sides, and he understood what happened. Masao-san walked over shortly after, and he removed both Kiku-kun and Kaori-chan from his waist. I apologize, Midoriya-san. They wanted to welcome you back personally, Masao-san told him, and Kaori-chan pouted at him. Don't act like you didn't miss him, Annie-chan, she said, pointing an accusing finger at him. Masao-san side-eyed her. I didn't say I didn't, just that I don't lack the self-restraint to jump him, he corrected, and Kiku-kun had the decency to look ashamed. I'm sorry for using my quirk on you, Deku-sensei. He apologized, letting his head hang. It's no PP problem. Izuku told him through forced uncooperative vocal cords as most of his body was still locked up. Masao-san put both kids down and moved to pick Izuku up. Everyone is waiting to see you at the community center. Akiko-san made cake, he explained as he carried him off, and Izuku would have beamed if he could move his lips. Akiko-san made great cakes. Underscore 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 underscore. Mizo was tired as he walked home from the station, making sure to pull up his mask so that it still covered his face. He was also trying to ignore the looks he got from just about everyone. even if he always got looks like this. Today was just worse than usual. It seemed like everyone he would normally run into when he went to school would give him that look. His classmates hadn't bothered to pretend to be quiet when they were talking about him. The teachers didn't address what his classmates were saying either. His history teacher gave them a pop quiz, and Mizo could swear the school bells were getting louder by the day, and that was starting to hurt his ears. And on the train back were two women all too happy to talk about him and everything they thought was wrong with his generation, or more specifically him. Mizo was never happier to get off the train before and planned to get home to do his homework. Honestly, moving to the south side hadn't been as much of a hassle he thought it would be. Sure, he had to be a bit more vigilant about stumbling into something dangerous because there were more gangs in the area, but at least he didn't get as openly gawked at. Their new apartment was also much better than their old place. Mizo even had his own room, and the apartment's heating actually worked as it was supposed to. Mom also seemed much happier with her new job, even if she was working more. He hadn't heard any complaints from anyone at least. Mizo was a bit surprised that the people he'd normally see aren't there today, but he just tried to brush it off. He wasn't going to see the same people on the street every day, and they clearly had lives of their own. So he just took advantage of the calm to get home in one piece, hopefully without having to take a detour. Mizo had just gotten to the complex, and perhaps he wasn't as aware as he should have been because someone ran into him. Not hard, but the other person was carrying a box that would have hit the floor if he didn't catch it with a secondary pair of hands. "Oh no, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to run into you. Are you okay?" the person asked, and Mizo turned to them only to freeze. Mom had always made a point of telling him what their landlord looked like so that he didn't get them accidentally kicked out, or their rent doubled. So one could imagine the dread he felt when he realized that the person that ran into him was their landlord and his mom's boss. Midoriya-san was exactly as she described and seemed more interested in apologizing to him than the fact Mizo was also holding him up in one of his secondary arms. Mizo quickly righted himself, letting go of Midoriya-san and giving the box he was holding back. "I'm fine. I apologize for bumping into you, Midoriya-san," he told him, mentally praying he hadn't just screwed up the best thing to have happened to them since ever. Midoriya-san blinked, taken aback. No, it's my fault really. I was the one that bumped into you. I should have been watching where I was going," he assured, then glanced at the secondary arm he used to form a mouth before he brightened up with a soft gasp. "Oh my gosh, is that your quirk? That's so cool. It must have taken you a lot of work to learn how to do that. Can you make other body parts, like ears or eyes? Are you limited to replicating your own body parts, or can you make the limbs of other animals? Can you make more limbs, or are you limited to just the 8 you have now?" Midoriya-san began rambling. There were practically stars in his eyes as a torrent of questions spilled from his mouth, leaving Mizo to be shocked. Was Midoriya-san actually interested in what he could do with his quirk? He wasn't creeped out by the mouth he made with his hand. Just when Mizo thought Midoriya-san would never run out of questions for him about his quirk, the greenette slapped his hand over his mouth. Midoriya-san had taken a 180, becoming very meek and slightly pale. I'm so sorry. That was so inappropriate of me. I shouldn't have said any of that. I know how creepy and invasive it is to ask about your Q quirk." An apology springing forth from him, his hands flying everywhere as he did, and Mizo had to catch the box again. They were both silent for a second as Midoriya-san refused to meet his eyes, covering his face with his arms. "It's not creepy." Mizo tried to reassure him, but honestly, he was still caught up in the whiplash of Midoriya-san's change in demeanor. Midoriya-san's eyes shot wide open. "Are really?" Midoriya-san asked, whispering so quietly Mizo only heard it because of his enhanced hearing. And Mizo hesitated because the one question about what would happen if one of his secondary limbs got cut off was a tad bit creepy. But Midoriya-san's questions hadn't been offensive in any way he could think of. Mizo was more flustered by the attention than creeped out, really. He confirmed with a nod, and he could see the second Midoriya-san was hit by relief. "Thank God." The brunette muttered under his breath, a finger lightly scratching his cheek. Here, Mizo said, offering the box back, and Midoriya-san's face turned a tad red as he took it back. Right, thank you, he replied, still very bashful. Why, you're Shoji-san's son, Mizo-kun, right? Midoriya-san asked sheepishly, and Mizo nodded. Masao-san mentioned you. He said you both go to Shiritsu. The brunette explained, having regained some confidence. Yes, Miyake-senpai is hard to miss. Reptile mutation aside, Miyake-senpai is the only person I've met my age that was taller than me. Mizo mused in his head. Meeting him had been rather surreal, as he had become used to towering over most people at 5'9" ft. This is embarrassing. I'm sorry for not introducing myself to you earlier. I've been kind of busy. Midoriya-san apologized again. I've heard. Mizo commented, recalling multiple times overhearing his neighbors talking about him leaving to travel. Why, yeah, but I still shouldn't have bombarded you with questions about your quirk, Midoriya-san added with an awkward chuckle. Mizo frowned when he said that because while he hadn't expected it, Midoriya's questions weren't fully unwelcome. He had honestly thought he knew what his quirk did pretty well. He could grow multiple limbs from his 6 arms and transform the ends into hands, facial features to enhance one of his senses, or even another head if he wanted. But he couldn't even answer half of Midoriya-san's questions if he wanted to. It's all right, I just don't know the answer to most of your questions, he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. His previous counselors certainly hadn't asked him to try much of anything after seeing him form other copies of his own features. His quirk had always just freaked them out too much, and he admittedly wasn't that invested in exploring his quirk's boundaries in retrospect. Part of Mizo was disappointed that he didn't know as much as he previously believed about the quirk he's had since birth. A lot of the questions Midoriya-san had asked were kind of vital to know, like what would happen if a secondary arm got cut off. Mizo was now somewhat worried if such a loss would be permanent. Midoriya-san didn't seem disappointed by his confession. Oh well, it wouldn't be too difficult to test most of that. Honestly, I think you've figured out the most difficult parts if you can communicate so flawlessly with the mouths you made. He softly encouraged, and Mizo felt touched by the brunette's acknowledgement of the work he put into making his secondary mouths functional. It had taken him years to perfect the temporary vocal cords. I'd probably suggest you start by seeing if you mimic someone's voice, since you've had practice making vocal cords to mimic your own voice, or seeing if you can push the boundaries of the features you replicate by trying to extend the tongue in your hand-mouth by a few inches. It's a great starting point since it's a soft muscle instead of shifting hard bone matter. Midoriya-san recommended, and Mizo had half a mind to try that. Mimicking someone else's voice sounded like something that would be incredibly useful for a hero, and there were a lot of people who could imitate other people's voices without any aid of a quirk. Voice acting was a whole career and everything. But Mizo hadn't made the connection to building his temporary vocal cords to imitation at all. That sounds like a good idea, Midoriya-san. I'll have to try that. You seem to know a lot about quirks. Do you have an analysis quirk of some kind? Mizo told him, finding himself a bit curious since he would have been sure Mom would have mentioned that. Midoriya-san's face got red, and he awkwardly chuckled again. What? No, and nothing like that. Quirk analysis is just a hobby I've had since I was young. I'm in college for it actually, but I'm really flattered you think I'm anywhere near that smart, he bashfully explained, trying to brush the compliment off. Mizo blinked, surprised. You're in college? He asked. He didn't know people without intelligence quirks were allowed to start college at their age. Midoriya-san got more flustered. Well, it's online courses, so I don't have to go to a campus except F for when I take my F finals to finish the course and graduate. Midoriya-san elaborated. Not that it put a dent in Mizo's awe, because online or not, that was very impressive to manage at their age on top of owning property. Going back to your quirk. You don't have to tell me anything about your quirk, Mizo-kun, or try anything I mention. We hardly know each other, and I don't expect you to tell me anything private like that. Midoriya-san insisted, shyly ducking his head, still a touch red-faced. Mizo stood staring at Midoriya-san. He wasn't sure if he was the best judge of character, but nothing about Midoriya-san had sent him any red flags other than the brief dismemberment question. So after a moment of consideration, he couldn't quite see a downside to talking about his quirk with Midoriya-san. He probably learned more about his quirk in the past few minutes with the greenette than years of counseling sessions. "I don't mind talking about quirks with you, Midoriya-san," Mizo told him. Midoriya-san's mouth fell open, and he stared back Mizo, blinking multiple times. "Why you don't?" he asked in a voice hardly above a whisper. Mizo nodded. "Not at all, Midoriya-san. You had some interesting ideas I want to try out," Mizo admitted, and he regretted it for a second as tears built up in the corners of Midoriya-san's eyes. The next, the greenette was overwhelming him with his sheer joy, and his positively was infectious as he thanked Mizo. He oohed and ahed over everything Mizo told him about his quirk after he stopped, and it was all completely sincere. Mizo had slipped near the end and had mentioned he had plans to become a hero, making the boy gasp. "Mizo-kun, you would be an amazing hero," Midoriya-san exclaimed, stars in his eyes as he went on to point out practically 100 reasons why Mizo would be great in heroics. The greenette seemed to explode in his happiness, and Mizo could hardly make out what he was saying because of how fast Midoriya-san was speaking. Thankfully for Mizo, Midoriya-san calmed down, but was still incredibly excited to discuss ways to use his quirk as he walked Mizo to his unit. Izuku was surprised he and Mizo-kun had gotten along so well when they met, especially after he made an absolute fool of himself by ranting about Mizo-kun's quirk. And while Dupli Arms was incredibly fascinating and perfect for heroics, he really shouldn't have gushed like that in front of Mizo-kun. Izuku wasn't sure why Mizo-kun was entertaining him, but he greatly enjoyed hearing Mizo-kun talk about how he learned to make vocal cords before he could try talking with the mouths. Unfortunately, Izuku had other things to do, so he traded numbers with Mizo-kun before he rushed off to deliver the package. Considering how many times he dropped it, he was very lucky it wasn't fragile. He had spent that night in another unit with the Tanakas, and had to admit he was relieved that the dog hadn't faced any permanent damage. Taka, as the dog was named, seemed to not hold a grudge against Izuku, as the dog warmly welcomed him by licking his face. The dog also decided to curl up with him on the couch, and Izuku was kind of thankful he wasn't alone for the night. Izuku tried not to be too much of a burden for Tanaka-san, making breakfast for her and Kiku-kun before heading off to the station. Despite how early it was, he got stopped a few times to say bye. Settling on the train headed to Aomori, Izuku didn't find himself as distressed as when he traveled from Kumamoto to Kuchai. Thus, he was able to enjoy the countryside like he did the first 2 days when he started this journey. He also could take pictures for his mom and the Bakugas since he wasn't busy driving. And the ferry was so much better this time around when he didn't feel like he was going to throw up with every sway of the boat. Hokkaido was bigger and the cities were more spaced out, so he chose to forego his info binging and only do 3 hours of college today. Izuku would just make up for it tomorrow on Sunday after he got home. The red light districts on the island were probably the best looking, given that the people had the rich natural resources around to provide for themselves. He had met a couple more quirkless people along the way, and honestly at this point Izuku was pretty sure the entire Japanese population of quirkless people were completely migratory. Not that he could blame them, since a good deal of them also knew All for One had a preference for making them disappear if they stuck around too long. After he finished teaching and introducing himself in the districts, he hopped on a train to head back to the ferry. Izuku had plans to book an overnight train to be back in Shizuoka by Sunday morning. Taking an overnight train was more cost-efficient in the long run, as there wasn't anything he could get from a hotel that he couldn't also get from an overnight train, and he'd get more time with his mom on Sunday. He'd been lucky to catch the last ferry at the terminal and happily took some pictures, though a part of his brain nagged at him that things were going his way just a bit too much, and that left him a bit anxious. Using his limited data, he quickly double-checked he could make the connection to get to his train. He could, easily, so he checked if there were any hero versus villain fights so that he wouldn't be needlessly paying money for a ride that wouldn't happen. When he saw there wasn't, he had a quick glance around at the other passengers. This feeling that something was going to happen was rarely wrong and saved him from Kaken's wrath more than once. A person rarely abandoned their instincts after surviving on them for so long, and as paranoid as it made him sound, he was going to trust those instincts, trusted them so much that by the time he got on the train he was justifiably flinching at any sharp movement in his direction. Well, perhaps justifiable to anyone quirkless, or that knew of all for one. Izuku settled in his small cabin, but couldn't really fall asleep as his nerves kept him too on edge. He was heavily debating whether or not to use up his data to listen to something put himself at ease when there was a knock at his door. Izuku's body tensed, and he hesitated before cautiously approached the door with his taser in hand. He should get Auntie Mitsuchin a gift for getting him it. Timidly, he debated not answering when a second more insistent knocking came from his door. Izuku's body was trembling as he reached for the door and cracked it open just enough to see outside, but he was ready to slam it shut if necessary. However, Izuku wasn't faced with some stereotypical mobster, but a little girl that couldn't have been older than 6. Izuku's brain stalled as he stared at her. "Please let me in. I need to hide. Please help me, Mr. Please help me. Please, please," the girl pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Snapping out of his stupor, Izuku yanked open the door and swiftly ushered the girl inside without question, then slammed the door shut and locked it. Izuku was about to ask the girl why she was so frightened when an echoing voice called from the hallway, "Come on, kiddo. Come out, Tilda, come out wherever you are. Little bitch." Causing the girl to bury her face into Izuku's stomach, bawling uncontrollably. Izuku sharply inhaled and wrapped his arms tightly around the girl, forcing her to sit against the door with him, shushing her as quietly as he could once. He heard the man calling for the girl. As he passed by his cabin, Izuku could hear the man pause outside, and Izuku quickly put his hand over the girl's mouth. They both sat holding their breath as they rigidly waited for any sound of the man. After what felt like an eternity, the man cursed and continued to call for the girl as he got further and further from Izuku's cabin. It wasn't until Izuku was absolutely sure he couldn't hear the man's voice before he allowed himself to relax. He sighed, removing his hand from the girl's mouth, and turned to her to get a better look at her. The girl's quirk was fairly obvious as he noted 2 long floppy ears limply hung from where her ears should be, and they were black like her hair, and she had a small matching fluffy rabbit tail. She was also older than he first thought, probably closer to 10. She was still very frightened as she clung to him, trembling. Izuku gently stroked her hair. "He's gone now. Are you all right?" he softly asked, getting a whimper back. But she nodded. Izuku gently pulled the girl into his arms, then carried her over to his bunk and got out a hanky to help clean up her face, looking the girl over for any injuries as he did, but he didn't see anything other than a hand-shaped bruise that took up a good chunk of her left arm. "What's your name?" Izuku questioned, wanting to put a name to her face. She sniffled, Yumiko. She told him, hands coming up to rub at her face. That's a pretty name, Yumiko-chan." He complimented, patting her on the head. "Can you tell what happened, Yumiko-chan?" he requested, not pushing her too hard about telling him. I was on the way to my room when he grabbed me. He dragged me away. I bit H's hand, then ran off. Then I knocked at your door and..." Yumiko trailed off, and Izuku quickly placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Yumiko-chan. Do you have anyone with you? Your parents or a sibling?" he inquired, because he wanted to know if someone was looking for Yumiko now and not when officers came knocking. Yumiko shook her head, and no, I was supposed to ride the train to visit Sobochin. She told him, and Izuku did notice what he originally thought was a bracelet was an unaccompanied minor bracelet. Izuku felt his guts turn at the thought of Yumiko staying in her cabin alone or returning so soon without anyone to protect her. "Okay, what's your stop, Yumiko-chan?" he prodded, checking what time it was on his phone. "Tokyo." She answered, and Izuku flinched. Tokyo was close to Yokohama, and Izuku had planned on changing trains 2 stations before to be safe. But he wasn't about to abandon Yumiko on a train with a kidnapper. "Oh, okay, I'm Deku-Sensei Yumiko-chan, and you can stay with me until we get to your stop, all right?" he offered. Yumiko nodded rapidly in response. "Thank you, Deku-Sensei," she said, utterly relieved by his offer. Izuku double-checked the door was secured, then went about helping Yumiko get ready for bed. She hadn't felt safe sleeping alone, so Izuku ended up laying down with her on the bed, instead of on the floor next to her. He set an alarm for when they would get near to Tokyo Station, then curled up with Yumiko under the blankets, making sure to keep himself between her and the door, Yumiko tucked close to his chest. Once they woke up, Izuku walked Yumiko to her cabin, his taser held in a death grip in the hand Yumiko wasn't holding. She got changed and got her bag that was left inside, then returned to Izuku's cabin to wait for the rest of the time to the stop. Izuku carried Yumiko off the train, easily handling both the girl and her bag in one arm. He and Yumiko had to look around for a moment, but the girl quickly spotted her grandmother and pointed her out to him. He saw an elderly woman that wasn't much taller than Yumiko and had a similar quirk. But her rabbit features were a soft pink like her hair, clutching her shirt as her attention was held by a second person with a rabbit quirk. "Sobachan," Yumiko called out to the woman, and both turned to them. The horror on the woman's face melted to relief as Izuku let Yumiko down to run over to her. The two hugged each other tightly, and the woman spoke in a language he knew he's heard, but didn't know that much of as she kissed Yumiko all over her face. Izuku had initially walked over to hand over Yumiko's bag, but the person Yumiko's grandmother was talking to had locked a death glare onto him the second he heard Yumiko. And despite the man being barely a meter tall, he had a glare strong enough to make Izuku sure that he'd have no trouble sending Izuku to the hospital. Even if Izuku wasn't as rapidly obsessing over heroes and their debuts, he knew of Mirko, how fast she was rising through the rankings, and how easily she could break concrete with a single kick. Yumiko, however, had unintentionally come to his rescue when her grandmother presumably asked what happened. "There was this man that tried to grab me on the train, but I got away and Deku-Sensei saved me. He saved my life," Yumiko exclaimed happily, making Izuku a touch flustered, and his hands began waving rapidly. I didn't do that much. Jay just hid you, Yumiko-chan, in my sea cabin," he quickly corrected. There was a flicker of recognition in the man's eyes once he heard Yumiko say his alias. But Izuku was a bit preoccupied with Yumiko's grandmother taking his hands and thanking him in a thick accent. The man placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, saying something in Italian. Izuku was now pretty sure they were speaking in Italian. The woman nodded and took Yumiko into a nearby cafe, leaving Izuku alone with the other rabbit-quirked person. The man differed from the other two as his ears were fully mobile and upright. He had white hair fur, so Izuku didn't think he was Yumiko's father. Plus, he was in his early 20s max. "So you're Deku-Sensei," he said with a knowing tone. His arms crossed as he still stared holes into Izuku. "Why, yeah," Izuku timidly responded. "We've heard something about a two-toes running around the island," he commented, glancing down at his shoes for a second. Izuku wasn't sure if the man knowing of him was a good thing or a bad thing. "A bunch of my cousins from Shizuoka have been saying you're not that bad," the man told him as he stepped closer to him. Izuku gulped, twirling his thumbs as he avoided the man's eyes. I just want tea to help people." Izuku muttered, his nerves getting the best of him. "Well, Deku-Sensei," he said, then jumped at Izuku, making him squeak as the man snatched Yumiko's bag from his hand. The man threw the bag over his shoulder, and he had placed his hand on Izuku's shoulder, making him bend down to his height when he landed. "If you ever need anything, just ask around the Vespas for Raijin," the man told him, then walked off to the cafe, leaving Izuku to stare at him, processing what he just said before he sighed. You know, it would be just Izuku's luck to get an in with one of the biggest mafia groups in Japan by rescuing a little girl. Why not? A little girl was how he befriended a Russian kingpin after all. Izuku could deal with this new connection he made on Monday. For now, He was going to focus on getting home and spending a nice Sunday alone with his mom. Izuku greatly enjoyed the Sunday he spent with his mom, cooking meals together and visiting a park so the two of them could get some fresh air and make some memories together before he left for Hiroshima the next day. The rest of September passed on without much fanfare compared to the first week. Nothing extremely life-altering like befriending any more mafias or gangs or discovering any other ancient evil masterminds walking around, thankfully. Izuku did notice he saw way more people with rabbit quirks around when he visited the red light districts. In addition to seeing the Vespas around, the people in the districts were a bit more open to his help. Izuku suspected the Vespas had something to do with it, considering Yuri-san said they were mainly information dealers. As he and his mother adjusted to his new schedule, Izuku couldn't say he hated the traveling any more than missing seeing his mom in person daily. His enjoyment of travel and his new work had returned and stayed even as he mastered the backroads and the highways, or when there was the odd detour caused by heroes and/or villains. In some ways, this new lifestyle was a bit freeing, and he could definitely see why Auntie Mitsuchin enjoyed it. Though on other days Izuku found himself questioning things as he became more involved in the underbelly of Japanese society. And then there were the times where he was in a hotel room trying to go to sleep. It was times like this when he was left with nothing but his mind that Izuku wondered, if all but briefly, if there was something wrong with him. Thinking back to his driving exam, he knew that he should have felt safe in a room filled with cops, and 2 years ago he certainly would have. But the closer he grew to the people in the districts, the less safe he felt interacting with any member of the police. There were times he had been pulled over by a cop as he drove between prefectures, and each time Izuku would be coldly held in rigid panic, praying he wouldn't be taken in for being so young despite having a license. All throughout September, Izuku has seen how the police treat people in the red light districts. Not every officer was so crude to the people living in the districts, but there were enough that were to reinforce his newly growing paranoia surrounding the police. Other times he'd wonder if something was wrong with him specifically for being able to just pick up everything and leave his mom alone in their apartment as he had. The moments of self-deprecation were thankfully few and far in between, as Izuku was usually tired from his work that day and never seemed to happen when he was home with his mom. However, with all of that being said, Izuku wasn't completely anxiety-free because despite how much he was working, he was fast approaching his college finals. Much like with his middle school work, Izuku had somehow burnt through almost all 4 years' worth of work in a little over a year. Izuku was rather flustered when he got the message informing him he just needed to set up a time to take the final exam in person. It was a Sunday, and he had subsequently been showered in praise and congratulations from his mom. He and his mom arranged it for that coming Thursday, and Izuku spent the next 3 days as an anxious mess, suddenly having a full 5 more hours to worry about it with nothing to distract him from his upcoming test. The only reason he didn't end up tearing up his nails or pacing a hole into a hotel room's floor was because of Yuri-san and Mizo-kun. He had already been talking with Yuri-san and having accepted that he was basically friends with the man they had expanded past just talking about Yukiko-chan and Anya-san. So Izuku would end up talking with Yuri-san about the things he learned during his coursework and small anecdotes of what he's done in the other districts. As for Mizo-kun, he had texted Izuku thanking him and asked for more advice since he managed the tongue thing. Mizo-kun even sent him a picture of a hand-mouth with a tongue as long as a ruler hanging out of it when Izuku asked. So the two of them had called each other to talk it over. Izuku praised him for figuring out how to extend soft muscle past what should normally be a physical limitation. He asked Mizo-kun if it was difficult, and suggested replacing the other teeth in his hand mouths with nothing but canines before trying to extend them. He also sent Mizo-kun a recording of himself saying a nursery rhyme for Mizo-kun to practice mimicking. He and Mizo-kun also talked a bit about other things like favorite heroes, since neither had much to talk about outside of that topic. Izuku tried once or twice to branch out to different things since he felt bad just talking about Mizo-kun's quirk. It was a bit stilted since they were both socially awkward beings apparently, but Izuku was able to find out Mizo-kun had a slight interest in animals. The day before his exams, Mizo-kun even sent him a video of a stray cat he normally saw on the way home. It was adorable and helped Izuku distress a good deal before his test. He also got some calls from the Bakugas wishing him luck for his graduation. Izuku got a lot of encouragement from his mom during their call at breakfast the day of the test, and he did his best to not let his nerves get to him. Walking on the college grounds was odd for him as it was surreal to be there. It all sort of hit him then that he was actually in college and might be graduating today. He got a bit more nervous to talk to the staff, mainly because the front desk lady obviously didn't believe him despite giving her everything he could for proof, including the confirmation letter the college had sent to him. "We don't take students that young," she sternly told him, clearly annoyed with his presence ever since she glanced at his shoes. Honestly, Izuku was halfway considering just giving up and finding someone else, but the woman was holding his documents still. He was going to ask her for his papers back when he suddenly felt a pawed hand on his arm. "Hey, Midoriya-kun." Izuku was startled, of course, and turned to see an early 20s-ish guy a foot shorter than him with a rabbit quirk smiling at him. The guy turned his attention to the lady behind the front desk. "Hey, wannabe-sen, you're not giving my friend here a hard time, are ya?" he asked in the sickly sweet way Izuku had come to recognize from when characters made thinly veiled threats to others in TV shows. The woman paled slightly and handed Izuku back his papers, as well the paper with where he was supposed to go for his finals, the one she claimed she didn't have. "Thanks, wannabe-san," the guy cheerfully said, and he dragged Izuku out of the building with him. "Thank you." He told the guy, "Nah, that was nothing. Just overheard that Patana giving you a hard time and figured I'd step in." The guy responded, brushing it off as, "Still, you didn't have to." Izuku protested and the guy scoffed, "I'd be a pretty crappy person letting the guy who saved my Sorella be bullied by some tart." The guy joked with a chuckle. Izuku didn't know much Italian, but he did know that word. "Oh, you're Yumiko-chan's brother?" he asked. The guy nodded. "Yeah, she hasn't shut up about her little two-toed hero," he answered with a wink, making Izuku flustered. I wasn't just going to let her be kidnapped," he responded, rubbing his neck and avoiding eye contact, feeling his heart twinge at being called that, the feeling oddly bittersweet. He gave an amused huff. "Yeah, most of you two-toes are a bunch of little goody two-shoes," he replied before changing the subject. "You're going to be taking your test with Wheeler-sensei. I know the campus pretty well, so I can take you to wherever you're going," he offered after glancing at the paper, and Izuku nodded, relieved at the idea of a guide through the fairly large campus. "So, you're majoring in quirk studies, right?" he inquired, and Izuku nodded again. "Why, you overheard that part too," Izuku guessed, and the guy smirked back at him. "Yeah, with how many of us there are, we Vespas have eyes and ears everywhere," he confirmed, flicking his left ear in a wide arc. His implications were not lost on the greenette. "I'm guessing that's how you heard my name," Izuku said, rubbing the back of his neck again after he put his documents away. "Yeah, most of us in Shizuoka and Niigata know your name, Deku-Sensei," he responded, the terrifying fact rolling out of his mouth so simply. "Our Raijin said if I ever needed anything to ask for him, but..." Izuku trailed off, gripping his messenger bag strap with white knuckles. "Yes," he prodded, clearly intrigued in what he was about to say. Do you think why you can keep my real name from getting out there? I know I can't hide behind an alias F forever, but..." "As a two-toes," Izuku muttered. His eyes locked on his feet, and the other guy huffed. "Sure thing, Deku-Sensei, but let's call it a personal favor for helping Yumiko." "So, Raijin still owes ya, okay?" he told him with another wink. Thanks," Izuku replied, then saw they were in front of a building. "And here we are. Good luck, Deku-Sensei," the guy encouraged with a light slap to his arm before he left Izuku on his own. Izuku took a deep breath, then entered the building and found the room for his test. Thankfully for Izuku, the test was not held by a quirkist, so he just had to deal with his anxiety over the test itself. 2 hours later, when he was being congratulated for completing his degree, Izuku found himself feeling it was anticlimactic as he signed his name on the certificate. Going home, he found himself questioning what to do with his 5 hours of free time since he'd finished college. Part of him thought of spending more time in the districts, but a bigger part of him wanted to go to college again. He'd really come to enjoy teaching, and he couldn't see a downside to getting a teaching license and degree. Being able to teach more efficiently would also be a benefit, since he was sure there were some things that he could use to help others learn better. Izuku would have to discuss this more with his mom to get her opinion. He was trying to remember which courses he could take this time around as he made his way home to safely stash his new quirk theory degree at home. Izuku was also thinking about whether or not he'd need to get a business license for the 5 stores he was getting made. He'd need to ask Auntie Mitsachin or Uncle Masachin if he did need a license to own small businesses. Walking into the apartment, he nearly had a heart attack when there was a series of 3 loud pops. Izuku shrieked, jumping back, and he was seconds away from grabbing his taser when he heard the cheers of "Congratulations." Caught off guard, he took a minute to look inside. Both his mom and the Bakugis stood there holding party poppers. "Oh, thank God," he mumbled with a sigh, clutching his chest over his racing heart. Auntie Mitsuchin was the first to come over to him and put him in a headlock, roughly ruffling his hair. "There's the little genius," she teasingly said, while Izuku squirmed meekly, trying to push her away. "Auntie," he whined, and Auntie Mitsuchin let him go, laughing. Izuku couldn't help chuckling himself as he was pulled into the small surprise party they had set up for his graduation. However, the best part of the day was when he went back to his room at the end of the night and found a small box stashed away in his desk. Inside were 2 small hand-made clay figures that vaguely looked like himself and Kaken, both of which carried the familiar faint scent of caramel. Izuku had a very good idea of where they came from, and honestly, this was probably the closest to an olive branch he'd get from Kaken. That didn't stop him from being overwhelmed to the point of tears when he realized that, though simple observation told Nezu a lot about people and the world around him, he understood in the short amount of time he'd been alive that a majority of humans weren't worth his time, as they were only following the established social construct made to preserve their species, and he saw little reason to entertain such people. Human behavior was fairly easy to comprehend with enough time, and Nezu hardly needed a fraction of it with his quirk. So for self-preservation, he gave as much as he needed to this societal contract for the autonomy he wanted. And to preserve it, he put himself in a place of power in the superhuman society that he was a part of. Hence his one-man campaign to become the principal of the infamous UA. However, that's not to say he didn't care for the children under his care. He absolutely did care for them, but he couldn't quite say he held any meaningful attachment to the hundreds of students that passed through UA's doors, as in his experience, a good portion of them simply never interacted with him outside of his role as principal and rarely kept contact after they graduated. Nezu was a being of logic, having found it to be the closest thing to a friend he could feasibly manage. It wasn't that he hadn't tried, but he understood and had long come to terms with the fact it was highly unlikely to be capable of any meaningful connection with another, human or otherwise. Nezu's intelligence was, despite how many would think, frankly speaking, nothing more than a byproduct of his quirk's nature, one that was the reason for his near-complete disconnect with others. Even the few humans he spoke to with intelligence quirks had this disconnection from him. With all this in mind, Nezu hardly saw any reason to waste his time and energy trying to form something that simply wasn't going to be sustainable. Hence why the majority of his connections were fellow intelligence-gathering heroes, undergrounders, or for mutual benefit. Which is why Nezu found himself in his office hours before any of the students would arrive, going over the multiple reports from his information networks with his breakfast and a cup of tea. This had become a mundane daily ritual for him. In addition to reading the patrol reports, he had multiple updated calculations of crime rates, Spliced in were different scientific papers for some variety as he took it all in. However, recently in the last week, Nezu had noticed something odd in the data he was receiving. It wasn't anything major yet, but the crime rates in certain prefectures had dipped by a minuscule number of a fraction, maybe less than 0.01% on certain days. Now, to most, that number could be easily overlooked, and Nezu had only briefly noted it the first time as he always did. But this number was not random as it floated around Japan in a consistent pattern. The number had also grown to surprising 0.15% from the first time he found it in September. Despite the seemingly innocuous nature of such a slight dip, Nezu understood too much about human behavior to think a crime rate change of 500%, no matter how small the numbers were, was benign. The statistics just didn't match up. Humans were often creatures of habit, and things didn't change that much in less than 2 months without some kind of outside influence. Of course, there could be over 100 reasons to explain the number, but very few were compatible with the clear migration the number had, or the recent introduction of the lingering dropped rate of 0.05% in the last week. This change had to be man-made. He highly doubted anyone would believe that theory out of hand. But some recent patrol reports and informants had gleaned something that had finally given Nezu solid grounding for his statistical oddity. A name had begun to be mentioned in various circles in the affected prefectures, and such an odd name it was. Deku-Sensei, meaning a worthless teacher or a useless teacher. From what little he scrounged up, Nezu had strong reason to believe that this Deku-Sensei was some variant of an information broker. He had 3 reports from undergrounders in different prefectures that weren't touching, but a part of the migration pattern where the hero in question overheard criminals suggesting going to Deku-Sensei if they needed to know something. Another report from a different undergrounder who patrolled one of the affected prefectures briefly described a conversation between a drug dealer and a client before they were both arrested. One where the client was giving details to the dealer on how to meet up with Deku-Sensei. Having a new information broker in the criminal racket wasn't new and could be mildly concerning depending on the information they were dealing in. That thought was crushed, however, when paired with the drop in crime rate because Deku-Sensei was obviously behind it. Deku-Sensei might not just be an information broker like he previously believed, but possibly some kind of puppet master hiding in the shadows and recruiting through favors. And puppet teacher certainly made more sense than the other possibilities. And today he got a report from one of his informants that was giving some evidence to believe his theory was a bit more credible than previously believed. The report itself was mostly comprised of just rumors, as the informant wasn't as involved in criminal matters. But he did manage to overhear a small-time crook being told to go to Deku-Sensei if he wanted help with his problem. 2 weeks later, the crook escaped from a hero in the top 100 using his quirk in a previously unseen way. This proved that Deku-Sensei was offering something to these people. Whether it was just information or something else like strategies, either way, Deku-Sensei was clearly getting themselves a much larger hold in the Japanese criminal element, and that could be a threat. Deku-Sensei was clearly establishing themselves and gaining ties, all while hiding under the authorities' radar so perfectly that the underground and intelligence-gathering communities were only just now finding breadcrumbs. This was a minor issue right now, but Nezu could capably predict Deku-Sensei would only get bolder and might cause them serious problems in the future if left alone. So in order to properly deal with Deku-Sensei, Nezu composed some carefully worded emails to his fellow information gatherers to keep an ear out for any information on Deku-Sensei. He also sent a similar email to the Underground Hero forums to message him if they come across anything involving Deku-Sensei. Getting as much information about this mysterious broker was essential for proper capture of the individual, if necessary. There was still a lot of this Deku-Sensei Nezu didn't know, and Nezu would always consider the unknown dangerous. Finishing up, Nezu cleaned up his office, putting the papers away in their proper places. Anything mentioning Deku-Sensei was stashed away in the special attention drawer in his desk. Then he checked the cameras for how many of his teachers were in and where. It was only half an hour before school started, so a portion of his staff were in the teacher's lounge, and he made his way to see them about this possible issue. While a good deal of them weren't in the underground or intelligence community, he saw no reason to exclude his staff in heroics from the loop. After all, it probably wouldn't hurt to also have a few limelight heroes on the lookout for Deku-Sensei. He quietly entered the teacher's lounge and carefully set himself up on top of a bookshelf, waiting a moment to see if any of them had the situational awareness to notice him before announcing himself. None of them did, but it was always more entertaining to test them to see if any of them were getting better. "Wonderful morning today, isn't it, Majima-san?" he asked, popping out of his spot and into Majima's arms, startling the many hero course teachers inside the room. Yeah, Nezu-san, gee, great morning," Majima nervously answered, careful to not move or knock Nezu off as he climbed down Majima's body. "Do you need something, Nezu-san?" Bullet Jacker, heroics department head and heroics teacher for the year, asked, unfazed by the mammal's entrance as she continued writing on some documents. Nezu grinned back at her. "Actually, there is something I'd like to speak to you all about," he confirmed, climbing onto the couch. He could see some of them were dreading the news he was possibly going to give them. He would have begun to explain. However, he heard a familiar pair of footsteps heading to the lounge before the door was loudly opened. At the door was a tired and highly irritated Aizawa, who aggressively trudged through the room towards the coffee machine. Despite Aizawa's prickly demeanor, the human was one of Nezu's few favorites. After all, he didn't often find such an interesting contradiction in person, much less the pleasure of one willing to stick around, as most humans he found interesting had the common sense to be wary of him. "Tough shift, Aizawa-san?" he inquired, watching as the man proceeded to down a cup of coffee like a shot. Aizawa had been covering another underground heroes patrol route in addition to his regular duties last night. Nezu thought that perhaps he should excuse Aizawa from teaching homeroom to allow him more time to rest. He didn't like his favorites forcing themselves through unnecessary distress. "Yeah, you don't look too good, partner," Genji added, having noticed Aizawa's more frazzled appearance like the others. Aizawa scoffed as he refilled his cup. "I'd like to see any of you look better after patrolling an entire prefecture by foot in one night." He spat back, pointing a threatening finger at the rest of the staff, then downed his second cup of coffee. Regaining some of his composure with the second dose of caffeine, he ran a hand through his hair, especially after that bullshit at the end. He grumbled, rubbing the bridge of his nose, the last bit, in particular, getting Nezu's attention as the peculiar fact that it was Friday flashed through his mind. Might Deku-Sensei perhaps still be in the area today? He mused. "Oh, do tell," he implored, choosing to speak of his theory either after Aizawa's debriefing or when school hours were over, whichever was more beneficial once he heard whatever happened at the end of Aizawa's patrol. One Aizawa's eyes twitched, and he groaned. "I was finishing up scripture's route in Yezu's red light when a fight broke out between two gangs," Aizawa replied as he moved towards the other couch. Yamada and Kayama shared concerned glances, as would any person who has known Aizawa and his lack of self-care. "Golly, sure must have been a tough fight all by your lonesome. You don't need to see Chiyo do your show?" Yamada playful asked, already searching for injuries on the brunette, though it was cleverly disguised by the blonde jumping Aizawa with a hug. Aizawa huffed, passive-aggressively waving Reed, shoved Yamada off in retaliation, his annoyance having nothing to do with his friend's invasion of his personal space. "That's the thing. I didn't have to fight anyone," he told him, making his exasperation of this fact clear. Did some naughty little limelight hero come along and spoil your fun by punishing those criminals before you could get a piece of the action? Kayama teasingly asked, wrapping her arms around him from behind the couch. She too was also subtly looking for injuries, which gained them far more points in Nezu's book. People genuinely caring for his favorites would always be a positive in his eyes. Aizawa, however, was grumpy, as he always was when this sleep deprivation and physically exhausted, and did not appreciate the woman's attention at the moment. Aizawa made this clear by briefly activating his quirk, making his hair go straight into Kayama's face, and she immediately pushed herself away, swiping at his floating hair. "No," Aizawa coolly said, ignoring the dramatic gagging from the woman as her hands brushed non-existent hair away from her face. "Then what, pray tell, happened to the two gangs?" Nezu pressed, quite intrigued by the outcome of this situation. Aizawa shook his head. "A kid gave them a pop quiz," he answered, his face in deadpan. There was a moment of silence before Ken broke and asked, "Are you serious?" Aizawa's eye twitched again. "No, I'm talking shit and yanking your chain," he said, voice dripping with pure sarcasm as he threw a glare over his shoulder at the blood hero. Ken reacted quickly, throwing his hands up in surrender. "Could you please elaborate what you mean, Aizawa-san?" Nezu requested, finding himself taken aback by the prospect. Aizawa groaned, throwing his head back and pinching the bridge of his nose. "I stumbled across the fight. Wasn't that big, maybe. Around 40 people in total." He began to lay out the details for them. "So, I was about to call for backup when this idiot gets the great idea to intervene by throwing a glass bottle in the middle of the two, put themselves between the groups, and launched straight into quizzing them about pre-quirk history," he explained, resigned to how ludicrous he sounded. "And that worked?" Majima asked, rightfully incredulous. "Yes, it did. They even answered his questions," Aizawa told them. "And that's not even the craziest part. When he finished, he told them to take their wounded and fuck off. And they did," he exclaimed, practically hissing the last part. "Seriously?" Genji questioned. He received a glare in return while Nezu hummed to himself. Perhaps the child had some kind of compulsion quirk that allowed him to order them around, he suggested, as that would make the most sense, and Aizawa only groaned, putting his head in his hands. "Great. A pint-sized vigilante that can literally tell us to FCK off," he quipped, getting up and going back to the coffee machine. "Well, it's only a possibility. Did you speak to the child?" Nezu inquired, though Aizawa was more focused on getting himself a third cup of coffee. "No, the problem child was one of the first to leave and was gone by the time the gangs cleared out, so I didn't see where they went," he grumbled, downing the third cup, then started to brew up another pot of coffee, knowing Aizawa that fact was probably a blow to his pride. "Aw, Cho, they were just lucky to get away." Yamada cooed, throwing himself at Aizawa again, accidentally knocking his coffee cup out of his hands. The two were silent as they stared at the scattered cup on the floor. "Hizashi," Aizawa snarled, rounding on the blonde before chasing the shrieking voice hero out of the room. "How puzzling." Nezu pondered out loud as Baki cleaned up the ceramic shards. First the oddity of Deku-Sensei, and now a child capable of diffusing high-tension firefights with a simple quiz. One that might be capable of losing one of the best in the underground heroics. How intriguing. Well, if there was one thing Nezu loved, it was a puzzle, and he had just been given two to play with. Izuku didn't have to do much to convince his mom to let him get a teaching degree, and she even encouraged it since he liked teaching in the red light districts. He was given a round of congratulations from everyone in the South Side when he spilled that he had graduated. He had to actively dissuade them from quickly throwing him a party down at the community center. Finishing up for the day, he went to his apartment complex to meet up with Mizo-kun. The two of them had grown tentatively closer as they spoke of how to test his quirk's capabilities. Izuku was consistently worrying about overstepping boundaries whenever he asked about testing his quirk. But Mizo-kun has been very reassuring throughout it all, and he did tell Izuku when he was crossing a line. Izuku had only done so once with the dismemberment question when they first met, and they refrained from touching that topic for now as neither was comfortable with exploring the idea. That being said, Izuku had found himself very fascinated with Mizo-kun's quirk and what he could actually do with it. Like right now, he was sitting in Mizo-kun's room, examining a snout-shaped mouth full of long human canines. "This is incredible work, Mizo-kun. Your ability to manipulate bone matter is getting so much better. Can you widen the base of your jawbones like a crocodile?" he inquired, tapping one of the fang-like canines. "I can," he responded, and the snout-like mouth changed to be more V-shaped. That's great, Mizo-kun. Have you made any progress with your imitation? Izuku said, gently pressing on the base to feel the difference in the jawbones. The boy brought his hand-mouth closer to Izuku. Sort of. I'm still working on it, but I'm almost close to mimicking your voice, he explained, the voice coming from his hand almost the same pitch as his own. That's okay, Mizo-kun. Don't forget to work on your inflections, though. They're just as important as an accent. Izuku told him with a pat on the boy's shoulder. What about the other thing? Have you been able to make your skin thicker or a different texture? He asked, since Mizo-kun had mentioned he had been working on it in their latest text chain. Mizo-kun rubbed the back of his neck. I can make it thicker, but I still haven't been able to make anything like scales or feathers, he admitted, changing the mouth in Izuku's hands to another hand with visibly thick skin. Izuku hummed back and lightly pressed against the thicker skin to see if he could still feel the bones and joints. That might be too big of a leap. You might try growing your hair as if it's fur first, Izuku suggested, watching as the skin became less thick and he started sprouting tufts of hair. Yeah, like that, Mizo-kun, he encouraged with a grin. Izuku and Mizo-kun continued talking for a bit before he left to stay in one of the other units for the night. While he was on good terms with the Shojis, Izuku didn't want to impose or make Shoji-san feel pressured to let him stay since he was her boss. Izuku walked with both Mizo-kun and Masao-san to the station the next morning, and he was able to say bye to them both before he jumped on to his train to Aomori. Honestly, Saturday was probably his favorite day other than Sunday at this point. Hitchhiking across Hokkaido was a very active process, and he enjoyed how hands-on he could get with it. Hokkaido was still the best-looking prefecture red light district-wise, and it was getting prettier as it began to snow. Stepping off the train at Shibuya Station, Izuku was torn between taking a picture of scenery or a video so he can get everything he wanted to show his mom. Leaning more towards a video, he decided to give himself a few minutes to take a nice video for her. Hiwa had some nice clearings right by the forest. It wasn't that much of a trek there, taking half-hour at most, and he had already taught his 4 hours in Otaru, so it should probably be okay. He spotted one of many rabbit-quirked people he'd become used to seeing wherever he went, and Izuku nodded to them. It might have been 2 months at most since he helped Yumiko, but with how abundant the Vespa family was, Izuku would probably be more worried if he hadn't seen them. The only times he didn't was when something happened in the area, big hero raids, firefights, etc. that resulted in quite a bit of damage. So Izuku, with all the wisdom that comes from hindsight, found himself grateful when he saw them, if only for his peace of mind. And wasn't that an outrageous thought? Midoriya Izuku, a boy who has always dreamed of being a hero, and having been bullied by just about everyone for being quirkless, finding comfort and relief from being not quite stalked by a major mafia group. Maybe there was some truth to when some of his ex-classmates said his life was some kind of joke. Moral quandaries aside, Izuku busied himself by hurrying over to the first clearing he could find and started getting ready to record himself in the field of snow. As Izuku tended to do when he spoke, it was a touch awkward at the beginning as he didn't quite know where to start. Slowly he fell into rambling about his work in the area or his classes that day. Near the end of the video, he made some promises that he'd show her the spots he liked if they ever found the time for a trip together. Izuku sent the video off to his mom, and he went on to add Hiwa to the ever-growing list of places to bring mom. A list that had a life of its own, as he never found a shortage of cool little areas that he thought his mom would love to visit, and as smart as Izuku was constantly being told he was, he did not think he had an eidetic memory and needed to write the places down. He was 50% sure he didn't anyway. Izuku had just put his phone away and was going to start heading back to the city when an odd sensation suddenly washed over him. The feeling left him nauseous and his legs weaker, making him shakily take a step back to better ground himself. It worked for all of 10 seconds as a second wave of the sensation caused him to fall onto his bottom. As a dull ringing made itself known in his ears, Izuku couldn't help panicking over what was going on. Okay. Don't panic, Izuku. Do not panic. You need to get a hold of yourself, he mentally told himself, trying to force his breathing to become even again. Izuku was successful in wrangling his lungs into order, but his heart just wasn't cooperating. Maybe a side effect of what was causing this. He thought, crawling over towards the tree line. But what is this? It can't be something I ate. I had the same thing for lunch I do every time I come here, and it didn't taste off. A quirk maybe. Is that tree moving? He mentally questioned, watching the branches of the tree he planned to use to get back on his feet. Izuku's vision had to be affected as well, because that was the only explanation for the way the limbs were twisting. Whatever quirk this is, it is definitely mental. But why am I being hit by anyone's quirk? I haven't gotten in between any local gang fights, and the Kitsune Fangs didn't have members or territory this far north, he thought as he got himself to his feet, leaning on the tree for complete support. Maybe I haven't been as careful as I thought I was with my work. Did someone accidentally let it slip to all for one that Deku-Sensei was a two-toes? He fearfully wondered, his eyes darting around for any people-shaped figures. He didn't see anyone, but his eyes weren't completely trustworthy at the moment. Izuku would have tried to call for help, but he doubted he could properly dial the buttons, and he was about to risk yelling for one of the Vespas when he heard the snap of a branch echoing in his ears along with the ringing. He whipped his head towards the noise and caught a glimpse of gray and dark green. Izuku stumbled after the figure, falling over into the snow at least 3 times, and the closer he got, the more his vision distorted, and the ringing became sharper. After a few minutes, he caught up enough to see just who the figure was. A small, striped dark green young boy with gray hair, a tail, and brown horns stood across from him, and unlike everything else, Izuku could see the boy clearly. He could see the panic in the boy's eyes as he pressed himself against a tree that was bent in half and his chest practically heaving. Izuku's head started to throb as he stared at the kid and was barely stringing together that he had to be under the kid's quirk when the kid ran off again. Wait! Izuku croaked out, following the boy through the twisted and warped forest. Izuku fell a couple more times, and the kid threw some snow in his face before he could reach the boy. Calm down, he tried to say, but the kid reared up and almost slashed Izuku with his clawed fingers. Let me go! The boy screeched desperately, trying to pull his other arm out of Izuku's hand. Izuku released the boy's arm and raised both of his in surrender. Oh, okay, I won't touch you. But please don't run off, he requested, watching the boy scramble away from him, and the boy pressed himself against another warped tree. It was probably due to Izuku's previous experience dealing with being, well, a mess that allowed him to function with his screwed-up senses as well as he did. And while Izuku could stay on his feet, he decided to conserve his energy and let himself sit down in the snow. Why you, okay? Why were you running? Izuku asked, having seen how scared the boy was. Maybe he's scared of getting in trouble from using his quirk in public. He considered it because of the side effects of the boy's quirk. I just wanted T to stop. The boy mumbled, body shivering as he hugged himself, and as concerned Izuku was over what he said. Izuku could see the boy wasn't dressed for the weather, missing anything that could be considered a coat or boots. Izuku unzipped his coat and offered it to the boy. Here. Izuku told him, hoping he wasn't making a fool of himself by grossly misjudging where he was in relation to the boy. The boy might have been out longer than Izuku could have thought, as the boy hesitated for a few seconds before he quickly walked over to Izuku. The kid was around 5 to 6, so the coat that was big on Izuku easily swamped the boy, and the cold nipped where it could, leaving Izuku a touch more aware, and helped him keep his lunch where it belonged, in his stomach. Thanks, the boy muttered, burying himself into Izuku's coat. It's nothing. Don't want you to get sick? I'm Deku-Sensei, he responded and introduced himself, hoping it would prompt the boy to tell him his name in return. Kaoru, he said back. Izuku nodded his head, probably lopsided, and asked, It's nice to meet you, Kaoru-kun. Is this the first time this has happened? Kaoru nodded, moving to sit closer to Izuku. Do why you know what triggered your Q quirk? He asked, since it was common for quirk accidents to happen at Kaoru's age. The boy blinked, taken aback, as he stared at Izuku, confused. Izuku's vision became a touch less murky, at the same time as Kaoru asked, what? This isn't my quirk. My quirk is a mutation. Izuku looked back at the boy, himself confused, but quickly understood what Kaoru meant. The kid must have thought his odd features were the extent of his quirk, and that wasn't an uncommon misconception. Only 1 out of 5 mutation quirks have abilities considered unrelated to the physical mutations the person gained. Kaoru-kun mutation quirk C can have abilities that are separate from physical changes. He explained, and the boy ducked his head, the tree branches becoming even more gnarled and twisted before he hesitantly looked around at how warped the world around them was. So I'm causing this? Kaoru timidly asked, curling into himself and Izuku's coat. Any doubt Izuku had before was quashed by how everything warped and changed with Kaoru's emotions. Probably, but that's okay, Kaoru-kun. You're still young and accidents happen. Izuku assured, his hand moving to pat the boy's head, but he stopped halfway. I'm sorry. How do I make it stop? Kaoru asked, looking like he was about to cry. Izuku's vision getting so bad his own body was starting to also get distorted. Kaoru-kun, you don't have to apologize. This was just an accident. You'll learn how to control it eventually. Let's focus on C, calming down and work from there. Izuku told him, using his hands to keep from falling over as he was losing his equilibrium. Try to follow my breathing, Kaoru-kun. Izuku instructed, making his breathing loud enough for the boy to hear, then used a grounding exercise to keep Kaoru relaxed, and the more they spoke, the less warped and twisted the world became. After that, Izuku went on to tell Kaoru about the places he's been. A few minutes later, the world was back to normal, though Izuku continued for a few minutes before mentioning it. I think we're good now, Kaoru-kun. Do you think you can walk to town? Izuku asked, wobbly, getting to his feet, feeling slightly lightheaded as he watched the boy trying to stand up himself. Kaoru was able to stand up, but Izuku didn't like how unsteady he was on his feet, likely due to quirk exhaustion as well as being cold. I can carry you, Kaoru-kun. You shouldn't force yourself to walk, he offered, crouching down to the boy. Kaoru nervously shuffled a bit before nodding. Oh, okay, he muttered. Izuku happily scooped the young boy into his arms. All right, now where was I? I think I was talking about my friend Kiku-kun, right? He asked, following his large and obvious tracks in the snow. It hadn't taken long for Izuku to reach the tree line, and Izuku was slightly glad because he was worried. He was going to start boring little Kaoru with his rambling. Oh, I'm sorry for not asking earlier, but what were you doing in the forest, Kaoru-kun? Izuku inquired. The boy might have some resistance to the cold from his quirk, but Izuku doubted any half-decent parent would just let their kid run around without shoes. And he would know, considering how many questionable parents he's come to know in his work in red lights. Kaoru buried his face in Izuku's shoulder. I was on a class field trip, he answered. A field trip, huh? Let's go find your group then. Your teacher must be worried after you disappeared. Izuku responded as he reached the other end of the clearing. Kaoru didn't say anything in reply, but Izuku's attention was caught by one of his many rabbit-quirked people following him. Izuku normally didn't interact with the Vespas outside of when the younger Vespas joined his lessons, but the woman would no doubt either know where Kaoru's class was or could at least help him find them. Excuse me, miss. Izuku called out, moving to meet the woman halfway. The woman had already seemed to be looking for him, so he hadn't needed to do much to get her attention. You doing all right, Deku-Sensei? She asked, skipping formalities, and she seemed just as concerned with the child he was carrying. Yeah, a bit cold, but I'm more concerned about getting him back to his class. Have you heard anything about that? Izuku questioned, walking along with the woman. One of her ears flicked as she hummed back. Might have heard the group you're looking for earlier, but didn't hear anything about a missing kid, she commented, and that made Izuku frown. As much as he adored children, he wasn't naive to how mean kids could be. His time in school was an excellent example of how cruel people could be regardless of age, and considering how Kaoru was when he found him, and the lack of concern was painting an unfortunate picture for him. "Well, that sounds like a great place to start. Mind leading the way?" he requested. "Not at all, Deku-Sensei," she replied, leading him away. Kaoru hadn't spoken much, though Izuku still tried to keep an eye on him and help him stay calm, so he didn't accidentally trigger his quirk again. Izuku couldn't say that his unease went away when he did find Kaoru's class. The two women he believed to be supervising the trip weren't as worried as he expected, considering they had a child missing for half an hour at least. How could they be so calm? Kaoru was not an easy child to overlook or lose in winter with his mutations. He glanced at his Lepus companion, and she looked at the group before returning his gaze with a raised eyebrow. Izuku nodded, then the two approached the group of around 11. "Hello, ma'am, are you missing one of your kids?" he questioned, getting just about everyone's attention. The women both seemed to jump when he spoke and turned towards him abruptly. "Oh no, not at all," the first woman assured with a dismissive wave of her hand. "So Kaoru-kun here isn't one of your kids?" Izuku pressed one of his hands, coming up to rough Kaoru's hair. In an instant both women paled. "Wa," the other said, turning around to check the kids. The first woman quickly walked over to Izuku, an apology slipping from her lips. "I'm so sorry. I don't know how he could have gotten away from us. I hope he hasn't caused you that much trouble." The woman held her arms out as if she expected Izuku to just hand the boy over to her. He just gave her a tight-lipped smile back and softly tightened his hold on Kaoru. "One of you has the number for Kaoru-kun's guardian, right?" he asked. His voice purposely kept neutral, not wanting to accidentally upset Kaoru. Kids were easily affected when adults started arguing, and Kaoru was already gripping his jacket. Izuku did not doubt that Kaoru wanted to be swallowed up by the ground from how he tried to make himself as small as possible in Izuku's arms. What? Why? This isn't the first time Ito-san has run off before, and I can assure you that his mother will be informed of this once she comes to collect him," the woman responded. Izuku did not like the way the woman said that, and he could now feel Kaoru's claws digging into his sides. As sharp as his little claws were, they were hardly painfully enough to faze him, and he didn't so much as flinch. "Well, I'm sure she'd like to know about Kaoru-kun's new quirk development right away, don't you think?" he sweetly replied, with his head tilted and his hand going back to playing with Kaoru's hair to distract him. "Q quirk development?" she sputtered, and Izuku grinned back at her. "I know, only a fifth of mutation quirk develops special abilities. So, we need to call his mom now so I can help her take the proper steps to help little Kaoru-kun," he gleefully told her. "So if you would so kindly tell me Kaoru-kun's mother's number," Izuku prompted, slightly readjusting his hold on Kaoru so the boy would be more comfortable. The flustered woman balked and fumbled over her words to the point Izuku could only make out syllables. "Well, ma'am, if you can't give me her number, I'm sure we are more than capable of finding Kaoru-kun's mom ourselves. I'm sure a smart boy like Kaoru-kun can remember where he lives." Izuku interrupted and quickly turned his back on the woman. The second woman backtracked hard and prattled off the mother's number. Izuku smiled, nodded back at her, and continued to leave, ignoring both women's protests. Honestly, if he didn't have Kaoru in his arms or a Vespa by his side, Izuku was sure he would have crumbled in front of them. However, the way Kaoru relaxed in his hold as soon as they left was enough to crush any doubts Izuku had about his actions. "Those women aren't very nice to you, are they, Kaoru-kun?" Izuku asked, and the boy nodded. "Not really," he muttered into his shoulder. Izuku raised Kaoru higher up and encouraged him to wrap his arms around his neck, which the boy hesitantly did before returning his face to Izuku's shoulder. "I'll have to mention that to your mom when we discuss your lessons," Izuku mused. Kaoru raised his head and blinked. "Am I what?" he questioned, staring up at the greenette, confused. Izuku nodded with a soft hum. "Of course, if I'm going to help you learn to use your quirk, I need to talk to your mom about how to go about it." Izuku responded, and Kaoru gaped at him. "You're going to help me? Just like that?" he asked, shocked. Izuku just smiled back at the boy. Your quirk is going to need a lot of work, so you'll need all the help you can get, Kaoru-kun. I'll only be here Saturdays, but you and your mom will be able to call me if anything happens." He answered simply enough, leaving the boy speechless. Izuku then focused on calling up Kaoru's mom and explaining the events of the last hour. Meeting Kaoru's mom was thankfully uneventful, and she was rightfully furious when he explained the supervisor's lackluster actions. Izuku was also glad that Kaoru's mental quirk wasn't some random evolution and she'd get him help from his grandparents. He still offered to help when he was in Haiwa, and he was able to get permission once he told her about his degree. Izuku made his goodbyes to the two after working out when he'd come by and sneakily patching up the cuts from Kaoru's claws in their bathroom. He went on to finish his rounds in the districts of Haiwa before making his way to the docks. Izuku knew he was behind his schedule by over an hour, but he held out hope that he just might make it to the last ferry before it leaves. However, upon reaching the closed terminal, that hope was dashed, and he sighed. Izuku sat himself down on a bench and opened his phone to search for a hotel for the night while calculating how to get home as fast as possible once he takes the first ferry in the morning. He was about to book a room when a voice called out from behind him, Midoriya said in Russian. Izuku squeaked, jumping to his feet and taser in hand as he whirled around towards who spoke. Upon seeing the familiar tall, pale figure, his shoulders slumped and he lowered his taser. "Oh God." "Yuri-san, what are you doing here?" Izuku asked, putting away his weapon. "I had business in Hakodate and thought I might be able to catch you before you left," he answered, and Izuku found that to be a reasonable explanation considering his job. "But when Valentine informed me you missed the last boat, I became worried," he explained, concern lacing his tone. "Oh, that? I got caught up helping a boy that discovered his quirk and well," Izuku replied, gesturing to nothing in particular. "I see," Yuri-san said, walking around the bench to stand beside him. "Would you perhaps like to join me on my boat back to Aomori then?" He softly offered his hands behind his back. Izuku blinked and brought his hand to his chin as he pondered the option and whether or not he trusted the Russian enough to take a cruise with him. Jumping onto a mobster's vehicle for an undetermined amount of time shouldn't be so tempting. But if he was being honest, Yuri-san has had plenty of opportunities to get rid of him if he wanted to. Izuku put his phone away and told Yuri-san, "Yeah, that sounds okay. Lead the way, Yuri-san." Then he followed the man to a ship that was easily 15 meters in length. "Yuri-san, that's not a boat. That's a yacht," Izuku pointed out. The man shrugged with one shoulder. "Yacht, boat, they both float. And commercial vessels aren't quite made for people such as myself," Yuri-san replied, brushing it off. Well, Izuku couldn't argue with that. Yuri-san's quirk aside, he was an easy 9.5 feet tall, and he had the money to pay for the comfort of not ducking his head to enter. So he just nodded and followed him on board. "Come, I'm sure you've yet to have dinner. We can eat in the cabin," Midoriya said in Russian. Yuri-san said, hand hovering behind Izuku's back. Izuku was going to turn him down, but the rumbling of his stomach betrayed him. "Tea, that would be great, Yuri-san," he responded, both resigned and a touch embarrassed at his own body outing him. Letting the man guide him below deck and sitting beside Yuri-san, well, he was within 2 feet of the man, which was the closest he managed so far, so Izuku counted it as a win. Yuri-san was presumably texting whoever was making them food. He rarely paid attention to anything other than Izuku when the boy was around, which was always something that made Izuku feel off, for lack of a better word. Izuku never specifically felt unsafe around Yuri-san, but anyone that had a clear interest and focus on him in particular always set off alarms in his head. "Yuri-san," he said, getting the man's attention. "Yes," Midoriya said in Russian. Yuri-san responded, turning to him. "What do you want from me?" Izuku asked in a rare moment of brazenness, making Yuri-san blink, staring at him in what Izuku believed was confusion. "Pardon?" he questioned, and Izuku ducked his head, rubbing the back of his neck. Izuku generally glossed over this looming feeling, but the closer they seemed to get made it all the more glaring for him. And maybe it was a side effect of the years of bullying and isolation, but the idea of anyone wanting to be around him was something he just couldn't understand. His mom, the Bakugas, were family and families were supposed to love each other. The people in the red light districts tolerated him because they had a mostly symbiotic relationship, where he helps them, and they let him do what he needs to so he can help. But he couldn't think of anything that Yuri-san could possibly gain from associating with him. Izuku himself hadn't been that close to Anya-san and Yukiko-chan, so Izuku couldn't blame it on that. And with how well-informed Yuri-san was, he severely doubted the man wanted Izuku to teach him anything. Yuri-san simply had 100 different resources he could blatantly take advantage of and an international enterprise to run, so he seriously doubted Yuri-san had the time to waste entertaining some kid. "You've got a lot of things to do, so why do you hang out with me?" Izuku rephrased his question. "Do I need a reason?" Yuri-san asked, and Izuku felt one of his eyes twitch at his deflection. "Yes," he exclaimed. "People don't just talk to me just because," Izuku countered, feeling that it was a valid argument. Yuri-san did not agree with that sentiment. Yuri-san's face twisted in an emotion Izuku couldn't quite identify as he exhaled and leaned back into his seat, more lightly rubbing his forehead. "Midoriya, for all I am, I'm still as human as you are," he told the brunette, "and for as long as I've been around, most of my life hasn't always been so kind to me," he confessed, getting a distant look in his eyes before his eyes focused on him again. Yuri-san huffed. "I can confidently say the last 50 or so years has mostly been the best of my life, because I've never had anyone I could consider as family before." He further admitted being oddly vulnerable with Izuku, which made Izuku unsure of how to feel. On one hand, he wanted to comfort Yuri-san regardless of the risk of frostbite, but on the other hand, Izuku wanted to question why Yuri-san would share such personal information with him. Friends or not, they were simply not at the point of revealing things like that. "And personally, Midoriya, I'm not ready to let go of that feeling, and while we're not blood, after everything you've done for my child and my little granddaughter," said in Russian, "I do consider you something like family," Yuri-san said, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. Izuku's heart stopped and his mind stalled. His chest was uncomfortably tight from the idea. Izuku had come to terms with Yuri-san being his friend, but the man actually having some kind of attachment to him. That straight up did not compute in his mind. It was even kind of scary, and not because of Yuri-san's job. If Izuku still had a serious problem with that, Izuku would have tried to cut ties as politely as he could months ago. No, it was just the fact that someone outside of family genuinely liked him enough to want him around. Izuku also found himself heavily questioning himself because this had come completely out of left field in his perspective. Normal people don't declare others family for no reason. Izuku was even about to fall into a downward spiral of whether or not he needed to completely re-evaluate all of his relationships with, well, everyone, when an icy cold hand brought him out of his thoughts. Yuri-san had removed his hand only a few seconds later, but it's certainly long enough to leave Izuku rattled. "I understand that you do not think of me that way, Midoriya, and that is fine. I am still mostly a stranger to you, and it would be very presumptuous of me to just insert myself into your life," Yuri-san calmly told him, which was oddly reassuring, mainly in the fact he wouldn't be expected to play house with Yuri-san. "I also understand this information might make you uncomfortable, and that you probably don't want to keep seeing me," he added sympathetically, but Izuku, despite his inner turmoil, rejected the idea. Yuri-san, regardless of his career choices, was someone who Izuku had come to think of as a good friend. He understood not wanting to let go of a good friend. His rapidly deteriorating relationship with Kaken was an excellent example of his inability to let go of people. So perhaps that is why Izuku was about to entertain the devil's advocate option and quietly asked, "What if I did have a reason?" Yuri-san's eyes locked on Izuku. "What kind of reason?" he questioned. Eyes narrowed, and Izuku awkwardly twiddled his thumbs. "Well, like if we had a deal, I come to see you and you teach me more Russian? Izuku tentatively suggested, mentally fumbling as he was the one taking charge for once. Well, other than seeking out the Urarakas, it probably was. Yuri-san stared at him, making him doubt himself. Is that what you want, Midoriya? He pressed, and Izuku timidly nodded, making him raise his brow. I'm certain, Yuri-san. Izuku assured his hand, going to rub some heat friction into the joint to counter Yuri-san's lingering chill. It didn't work, but it never hurts to try. Yuri-san brought his hand up to point at Izuku's affected shoulder and twirled one finger, somehow drawing the cold out of his body and condensing it to a small marble of ice. Izuku watched on transfixed, having never seen Yuri-san use his quirk before. I believe we have a deal then, Midoriya said in Russian. Yuri-san said, dropping the shiny little marble into Izuku's hands. Izuku shakily nodded before turning his eyes to the marble, and he examined it in utter fascination. His concerns over his friendship with Yuri-san weren't completely nullified, but he wasn't quite in the right frame of mind to process the full implications of this development. So, for now, he would just go with the flow and wondered if he'd be able to get the marble home before it melted. Thank you for joining us on this journey through What If Villain Deku Became a Teacher at UA. We hope you found it as captivating as we did. A big thank you to Bloomer Bill for creating such an engaging story. Don't forget to visit their profile on fanfiction.net for more fantastic works. The link is in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Zenin Fanfics for more intriguing explorations into fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we love hearing your thoughts and suggestions in the comments section. See you soon in the next video.